Great. Thanks, Sage. So now turning to the second of our Your Choice readings that were assigned this week, Sage and I looked at the chapter from Peter De Leon's book, Advice and Consent, The Development of the Policy Sciences, and specifically looked at chapter 2, The Policy Sciences as a Discipline. What the chapter or article does here is that it really provides the historical trajectory of public policy and policy analysis, and how the study has really moved from a somewhat infrequent process where I'd like to say out of sight, out of mind, where people didn't even really think about how best to evaluate or implement good social policy, to becoming much more institutionalized. Whereas today, most policymakers, most governments, they really ask those questions on how to make good social policy. And so, what the author does here is looking back, and starting with the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and really showing how the policy sciences have matured from their modest beginnings. And I also put in here modest and somewhat problematic beginnings. And so, what the author talks about is that in the beginning, historically, policy analysis was very elite focused. You had maybe a counselor advise a monarch, or a sage advise a ruler. But again, this very, very top down, hierarchical, really just focused on the elites and their interest. And that's really where the seeds of this kind of began for the author. And I think some could still make the argument that even today we're still struggling with a lot of that, and having policy analysis being a little more elite than perhaps it's intended to be. But I digress. So we don't really see until the 20th century where policy analysis really becomes more an institutionalized discipline. But even within that, there is a lot of different schools of thought within that. Some people even ask the question if the society's problems are just too complex to be properly captured and properly analyzed anywhere by a discipline. But eventually, what wins out is this multidisciplinary approach where the science really brings in economics, political science, psychology, and brings that into policy analysis to really capture that full picture, to provide some analysis on what good social policy could be, and what it looks like. But along the way of really getting there, there was a lot of failures. And I don't question that the author here is a proponent of policy analysis. I think this is the author's life's passion and life's work. But throughout the chapter, they talked a lot about how in order to refine policy analysis, there really had to be a lot of failures. They looked at various policies to address poverty in the 1960s and the 1950s, and those were not successful, and kind of sent a lot of the policy folks back to the drawing board in order to come up with a better approach. Even towards the end of the chapter, he really has to argue that the few achievements that policy analysis, public policy has really brought, that they weren't trivial, that even with all these failures, there has been some achievements in there. In this much better policy analysis, there's now these three different core elements. One is the multidisciplinary element that I talked about, which brings in the economics, the psychology, the political science into the discipline. But the other two that he lists are that it's problem-oriented, and that it has normative elements. And I guess the last thing that I would just say about this article is that I even reading this, I felt like there was a disconnect between the academic world and how in refining these public policy processes and really what's happening on the ground level. There was a really great quote in that book, and this comes from in the 1930s and 1940s from Robert Lind, who really asked the questions: what then was the ultimate purpose of knowledge? for its own sake or to better society. And again, I think that addresses that disconnect that I was talking about in the academic world, where are they really gathering this knowledge, this data, refining these processes simply for knowledge's sake, or is it really to better society? And that was definitely a theme that you saw throughout the trajectory that this article put together. The next and final reading that we did was big data in the policy cycle, policy decision making in the digital era. What the authors are arguing here is that advanced technologies can really transform public policy. In many ways, just like advanced technology and big data, advanced data analytics has really transformed the business world, and we read a lot about that. It can have the same really transformative impact on public policy. But unfortunately, the current policy landscape has a very limited view of technology and its implications, and what technology really can bring to the field. Right now, technology is viewed as an administrative support tool that can improve policy delivery and services. And this seems to be just a very basic element of what technology can bring, talking about how, well, now all of someone's records are located in a single electronic file, digitizing a lot of the paperwork. Again, this administrative, and yes, technology is helpful, but it's really in this support function and doesn't really do much to impact actual policy formation. So what the article here is saying is that, but we don't need to leave big data and technology at this administrative level. Technology can be transformative for policy formation as well. And one example, they talked about this, and this really connects to the policy cycle that we've read about as well this week. And they talk about the policy cycle and setting the agenda. So as we read in Weimer and Vinning, there's oftentimes questions on how agendas get set in this policy cycle and what gets included in these agendas, and then ultimately what does not get included, what gets left off. And through the readings, it seems like oftentimes whoever is the loudest on city council or in the government office really sets the agenda. Using technology and big data, however, by ways, let's say, aggregating and analyzing social media sentiments, we can really drive what gets put on the agenda. Big data and its analysis can show us what issues are really top of mind for constituents in real time, and those issues we can put on the agenda rather than relying solely on the policymaker hoping that he or she includes it. And one quote that I really liked from the book that I thought really hammered home the main topic and main theme that the author was trying to address was this: big data can be used for the large-scale incorporation and interpretation of public opinion and to bring knowledge and innovation into policymaking. But advanced technologies and big data aren't only just helpful in pinpointing what are maybe some of the social issues that should be addressed by policy and policymakers, but big data and emerging technologies can also be used to elevate, meaning make better, and evaluate the effectiveness, responsiveness, and relevancy of that policy. And here, how that works is, so there's an abundance of data that the public sector already captures, and it's really just time to put that data to work. For big data and advanced analytics to process, you need a lot of information and a lot of data, and we already know that the public sector is capturing so much of this already, and so it's time just to put all that data that they already have into various models and aggregators and analyze it that way, so that the data can really illuminate hidden patterns and correlations that policymakers can then act upon. And and there's a lot of ways to do this. You can put it into a model that's used as early indicators and early warning systems. You could use sentiment analysis of constituents and take this information to organize quick in meaningful collective action. You can better pinpoint social problems that we talked about earlier. There's a predictive analytics element to this. You can evaluate the existing programs and the program rollout and implementation that you've recently done. And so taking the volume, the velocity, the variety and quality of the data that the public sector is already capturing and putting it into this models, we can, again, really evaluate the effectiveness. And so with this, policymakers can really then act on the insights that they get from these models, which would enable better and more effective laws, programs, and regulations. But with all of the big data and advanced technology, emerging technologies that are coming, there's definitely challenges to this. One is the bureaucratic environment that is the public sector in general. We know that there's a lot of information sharing barriers from agencies to agencies, offices to offices. Sometimes they don't want to share, sometimes they're incapable of sharing because of archaic software inhibit them from collaborating together and extracting the amount of data that is needed for these big data systems. Again, you need a lot of data. Not in one agency is not going to have enough data alone, and it's really in bringing all of these sources of data that would make these models work. And then we also know that government has some agility problems. And here what I mean is government moves at a very slow pace, but with big data and data analytics, we're talking about real time here. We're talking about very, very fast and speed. And that does not always just coincide with the structure that government has. And finally, there's really a data privacy and a data bias issue. Health information that constituents might not want shared with others are now part of these models, and there's that the scariness that could then get out and be exposed. And you know, are these models, are they just simply collecting too much information on us and the privacy implementation and the policy problems that go on with that? And so those are definitely some challenges to keep in mind. And in certain ways, it's kind of related to our readings, the assigned readings, where they talked about ethics here, and really understanding what is the ethics with data privacy and data biases, and making sure that your models aren't biased or aren't giving preferable treatment to a certain gender, race, ethnicity, anything like that, as well as the ethics behind data privacy and making sure that you're not capturing, and if you are capturing, not using some really sensitive information that's out there. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sage to close us out.